What does Huma Abedin want readers to know about her life behind the headlines? She'll join us to discuss her new memoir, Both and. And how do you recreate a Chekhovian drama set on the Hudson in 2020? Gary Shteyngart will be here to talk about his new novel, Our Country Friends. Liz Harris will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's November 5th. I'm Pamela Paul. Huma Abedin joins us now from New York. She is the author of a memoir called Both and. Huma, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on your show.
I should have said both/and let's start with that title because it's not the obvious memoir title. What does that mean to you?
Well, we went through a series, my editor and I went through a series of options for the title. And I have to say, after going through what I had been told, at least at the time, a series of single word titles, which seemed to be the thing, at least for memoirs, none of them felt right. I had a couple that I loved that she hated. And then all of a sudden, this phrase just came into our conversation. And it just felt right. The minute, I've been trying to think about how to talk about this book because there are so many different themes, but it felt the most right. It felt the most me.
It's sort of holding more than two ideas in your head at the same time.
Well, the idea that you can be both and it felt particularly more poignant, more powerful at a time when I think we are living in an increasingly either or world. And that is not how I was raised. My parents, my father came from India, my mother from Pakistan. They were immigrants to this country. They believed in this idea and this ideal of America. They gave up their families, their lives in pursuit of education, met, fell in love, got married. I carried my American identity with great pride, as I write in the book. But they were always very particular about ensuring that we were exposed to different cultures and languages and faiths and people. And so we had the great privilege, they were professors, and we had the great privilege of spending every summer exploring a different part of the world. And it gave me a real appreciation for other worlds. And so as an adult, I feel like I can be in both and worlds and be comfortable. I can be an American patriot and a Muslim. I can be Indian and Pakistani. I mean, a lot of these themes are in the book. And I'm comfortable in all of these spaces.
Did you find writing the book therapeutic?
Oh my gosh, Pamela, it was the most therapeutic thing I could have possibly done. As I write in the book, my father, when I was a little girl, I opened the book introducing this notion that I grew up surrounded by stories, and my father and mother just filled our home with books and newspapers. And they were always, whether it was oral histories or written stories, that I was absorbing ever since I was a little girl. And I used to love to write. And my father had great confidence in my writing. And in fact, I tell the story in the book that when I was 9 or 10, my father brought back Silas Marner by George Eliot, AKA Marianne Evans, when I was 9 or 10. And I was so confused about why this woman, and I asked him, I said, Abu, why didn't she just use her own name? And he said, well, in the Victorian era, women weren't taken seriously as writers, but don't worry. When you write your book, you will use your own name and everyone will take it seriously. And so I think for me, it turned into a joy. I struggled at times, but it turned into a joy, and I'm glad I was able to do it.
Did you keep a diary?
I went through phases in my life where I wrote when things were really bad. So I did write a lot after my father died when I was 17. And I should say that I kept a diary, a quite meticulous diary when I was young. All of our world travels, I kept a diary. And I found those actually when I was back home in Saudi Arabia this past July, packing up our family home. And I found a lot of these diaries. And so I kept a diary, I would say probably till college. And then once I started working at the White House, that became difficult. So then it was fits and spurts. And the diaries did help. They did help as I was trying to jog my memory. Or more than that, getting a sense of what was going on in my head at the time.
stop there because you mentioned your family home in Saudi Arabia, and earlier you talked about your parents immigrating from India and Pakistan to this country. How did they end up in Saudi Arabia, and why did you pack up that home now?
Well, Pamela, I want to start by, or at least put it in broader context about this book. To me, to some extent, this book is really a love letter to my dad. That if he was alive today, this is what I'd want to show him and give him and say, this is what I did, and I hope you're proud of me.
Mm.
And the reason my father, who was extraordinary, and I want to note my mother is extraordinary also. I mean, I am so lucky to have two extraordinary parents, but when I was 2 years old and we were living in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and my dad was a professor at Western Michigan University, he was diagnosed with progressive renal failure. So the doctor at the hospital basically told him, you have 5 to 10 years and you should get your affairs in order. And so my father, and this is the story I write in the book, my father was told he was dying and he went out and lived. I mean, he walked out of that hospital and decided that whatever time he had left, he was going to make it an adventure. He was going to explore the world. He was going to teach his children about the world, about other cultures, about our faith. Both my parents were practicing Muslims, and that was very important for them to pass on to us. And so he'd had this opportunity for a sabbatical at a university, a new institution at the time, at a university in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah. And my mother, who was also a professor, they both got jobs and they went for 1 year. We went for 1 year in 1979. And I just packed my house a few months ago. It was sort of 1 year turned into coming back and coming back and coming back. And so even though America was home, we kept our home in Michigan. Our very, very large extended family lives in the United States. And we very much felt like we were Americans. We were raised as American Muslims, but we really were kind of all over the world. So we split our time. But the house I grew up in was in Saudi Arabia.
So you mentioned writing this book for your father. I want to stay with that for a minute because obviously we have to talk about some of the big things that this book covers. What was it like writing about this with your father in mind? Did you think like this is how I would want him to understand what I've been through? This is how I would want him to see this story?
The opening of the book is a note that I found of my father's in one of his files, actually after he passed away. He never actually gave that note to any of us. And it basically was, to me, summarized his approach to life, how one lives, which was basically to have faith in yourself, to follow your values and principles, and in the end, you're responsible for your own actions, and to be fair and decent and above board in all things. His life's work was exploring this condition of Muslim minorities around the world. He started an institute and a journal that explored that condition. And actually, he was prescient about a lot of things that have happened to Muslim minorities throughout the world, whether it's, the Uyghurs, the Rohingyas, or Muslims throughout Europe and the United States. So his guiding principle was trying to understand what is the other. And his friends and colleagues and other Muslim academics would say to him, why go into these conversations where even angels fear to tread? Why go to the mosques and synagogues and have interfaith dialogue? Why try to explore and understand? And he felt a great responsibility to do that. And I think he passed on this notion to me of approaching every decision in your life by assessing whether it's the right thing to do. And throughout my book, as from childhood through adulthood, as I talk about and explain decisions that I made, I always try to think, of what he would do. I write a scene when I go back to Saudi Arabia and I sit in my dad's office and say, what would my dad tell me? But it's just, what is the next right thing to do? And you can't listen to the outside voices. You have to listen to that voice in your head. And he raised us to be independent and to make our own choices. I think he knew he wasn't going to be around a very long time. And so he really taught us how to live without him from a very young age.
You can hear in your voice your love and respect for your father and how much you wanted to tell this part of your story.
Yes.
I have to ask, were you dreading writing the parts about Anthony Weiner?
I don't think dread is the right word for any part of this book and any part of the writing. I think that I had felt and do feel that for most of my adult life, somebody else has told my story. in public, and certainly as it relates to my marriage. And I felt if I didn't tell my own story, my own truth, then somebody else was writing my history. I didn't have any dread. I mean, in part, Pamela, in part, and I write about this in great detail, I lived with shame for so long and being the elephant in the room for so long. And I had to really power through. I had to overcome that trauma and regain my confidence, my own sort of sense of self-worth. And I believe my father would be very proud of me if you read the story and read every action that I took. I did try to do the right thing. I went into everything with the best intentions. It's funny, when we were announcing the book, one of my colleagues, Nick Merrill, who is Hillary's communications advisor, I said, I'm about to tweet to announce the book. And he said, okay, do you want to make a note in here saying that, you're nervous? And anybody who knows me knows that I'm terrified of public speaking. I've just started doing interviews in the last week. And during the 2016 campaign, I would be backstage shaking. I write a scene in the book where Hillary said I may have to speak on her behalf. And I literally want to throw up next to her. I'm that physically affected. And I don't feel nervous. I'm proud of the story. I feel like for so long, the headline around my name has been, what is wrong with her and what is she thinking?
What did you want people to know?
Well, number one, I wanted people to know what it's like to be an American Muslim. I think the average American does not know what sort of the basis, the basic principles, the creed, my faith stands for. I think that it is the reason why I write in detail about witnessing, starting in the Clinton administration and then beyond, all of the ways in which my faith was turned into a convenient boogeyman for certain forces in this country and turn it into a negative light and the negative effect it's had on the Muslim community. So that was actually very important to me. I mean, throughout the book, I talk about my faith and what it means and what it stands for. And I think a lot of friends who practice other faiths read it and say, oh my God, I didn't realize that, Moses was your prophet, or you believe in Jesus, or all of these connections, because ultimately, as I write in that chapter, my college chapter, I spent so much of my young adult life trying to make connections with other people, other races, other cultures, other languages. It's something that really fascinates me. So that was one. And then, I suspect you were referring to my marriage. Now that I am on the other side, I can say with confidence, I don't think what I went through is all that singular. I'm sorry to say. I think what's different is that I had to go through it on the front page of the news. And so I know there is a sisterhood and brotherhood of people out there in the world that have had to endure a betrayal and have had to figure out how to move on with their lives. And these are the conversations that I still am called into. The people who stop me on the street and ask me a simple question: when does it stop hurting? Should I stay? When do I leave? Thank you. Even what I had to endure is making a connection with people out there in the world. And so if my story and talking through how I got to the other side might help somebody, or maybe you take something from the story, or maybe you relate to something in the story, I think that might be a small service.
People came up with all of their own stories to explain what Huma was thinking, who you really were, why you did what you did. What was it like to confront those assumptions? I mean, first of all, you had to be quiet, or you chose to be quiet about it for so long. Was it a relief to get it out? And what did people really get wrong about you that you wanted to explain in this book?
I'm going to make a confession here in that I never read anything about myself. I actually suggest this in the book, that I really didn't pay attention to stories about myself, or it was frankly after the presidential election where my colleagues came up and said, you know what the most common headline about you is? What is wrong with her and what is she thinking? But I didn't know that in real time. I think that because I was silent, I became a vessel for whatever you wanted to feel about a woman betrayed, a woman staying in a marriage.
The good wife.
The good wife. the good wife. And that's why I put so much context. I write a lot about my marriage and the ups and downs that I had with Anthony. And it's also one of the reasons I chose to share that he was my first love. He was the first man I'd been with. And if people can stop for 1 second and think about that first heady, overwhelming love, I did have that with him. And when everything came crashing down, we were essentially newlyweds. I had just discovered I was pregnant. I write a scene at Buckingham Palace when, I was there with Hillary, who was at the time Secretary of State, and it was a state visit with President and Mrs. Obama. And I write a letter to Anthony. And to bring people into my state of mind, I was living what I would have told you then was a perfect life. I mean, we had everything. And most importantly, we had our health and we had these very purposeful jobs. And I was deeply, deeply in love with him. And so to get this shock to my system in 2011, I say it, I just wanted my life back. And I tried to figure out how to fix it, how to fix him, and regain some semblance of normalcy.
And even though you had a high-profile job, you definitely get the sense that you are a private person generally. And in the passage you're talking about, which was excerpted in Vogue this month, one of the things that you say was most upsetting to you was people finding out that you were pregnant before you had even had a chance to tell the people closest to you that you were expecting. You were like less than 12 weeks, right?
Yes, I was less than 12 weeks. That's correct. It's funny, a lot of my girlfriends have reached out to me after that Vogue excerpt. I mean, that is the irony for me. I knew that even though I was a private person, that by making the choice to marry who I married, and I also I take people through the process I went through before I chose to get to a place where I was comfortable marrying him. And I hope people will actually take that into consideration. I was nervous about stepping into the public space. I liked being invisible. I was a young advanced staffer at 21 in the White House. Our job was to be in the background. You were never in the shot. If you were in the shot or if you were talked about, it was never a good thing. And I kind of liked being in that space or place. It was always about Hillary or Anthony. And I never really wanted to be the center of attention, or I even talk about it at my wedding. I didn't want to be the center of attention at my own wedding. But that's why I write that scene with Philippe calling me, and, Philippe Reines, who at the time was a communications advisor to Hillary. I have these friends in my life who are willing to tell me hard truths. And what Philippe told me was that it was news, and he was right. So I could still feel hurt. I could still be angry. But if I was working at the Times in 2011, I would have run that story. I recognized the position I was in and the position I had put myself in. It didn't mean I couldn't have these very deep feelings, which I did have.
What did it feel like?
Then it felt, and that's why I have a chapter that's called Elephant in the Room. It felt like my sense of self, my confidence in myself, my capacity to just be out in the world without feeling like somebody was watching or recording or following. Following was a big thing. It was really shattered. I mean, it was really badly damaged. And the good thing is, for me, because I try to look on the bright side always, I was good at compartmentalizing. So the good thing was I had this extraordinary job. When my personal life was falling apart, I knew I could get on that plane and we'd be off to Africa and I would be participating in a worthy profession. And my work, to some extent, saved me for a long time, really saved my mental health, certainly.
It's good to keep busy.
Good to keep busy. Exactly.
Was it hard for you, though, it's hard for anyone when you're working on a memoir to try to access how you felt at the time as opposed to how you feel about how you felt at the time now. Was it hard for you to go back and to access that early falling in love phase with Anthony and just that immediate pain?
I did find going back and finding the letters that we wrote to each other, the notes from our early days of dating and being married, very hard to read. I did find those hard to read because the truth is, I did spend many years thinking I could get back what I had. I had to learn that was not possible. I had to figure out a new way to live and be in the world. what was helpful, I did keep a diary when we went to Houston for our first therapy session. And for writing the book, if you read those passages, friends of mine who've read it are quite stunned at the extreme detail I go into. But those notes I actually found were very helpful. And I kept thinking, I remember being so mad, so mad. And when I look at the notes, it sort of reaffirmed, oh yeah, I was mad. I was really mad.
Yeah. This all happened quite a while ago, years now. Did you decide right away, one day I'm going to write about this? Did you shut it out of your mind, do that compartmentalization? Or when did you say, I'm going to go back and write about this?
Absolutely not. No one has asked me this question. The campaign ended November 2016. And that whole next year, I just wanted to disappear. I wanted to shrivel up in a little ball and just be erased from the planet. Even though, and I write this scene in the book, a few weeks after Hillary's 2016 election loss, I get an email from Anna Wintour, the editor of Vogue. And she has been, over the last several years, a great friend and role model and supporter of mine. And she takes me to dinner, and I proceed to order 2 entrees and 2 desserts, realizing then that I hadn't eaten since, I couldn't remember when. And she said to me, I know what you should do next. You should write your memoir. And most of the early pages actually were written at her house. And so I was actually able to escape and focus and write. But when she said it at the time, I thought, this is the craziest idea ever. And I saw Hillary the next day for a meeting, and I said, oh my gosh, Anna thinks I should write my memoir. Isn't that the craziest thing you've ever heard? And she says, oh, no, I think it's a great idea. I think it'd be really good for you. And I think you have a story to tell. So it took, I want to say, a year to really, between, sometime in 2017, and full disclosure, I started hearing from all kinds of people in the literary world saying, you should consider this. And I think everyone else saying I should do it got me interested. But you know what really got me firmly decided on doing it was going out to lunch with a friend, an older friend. I said, I'm thinking about writing my book. And he said, oh, it's a terrible idea. Terrible idea. I mean, nobody wants to, read more about scandal. I mean, these questions are impossible to answer. You'll never be able to answer them satisfactorily. And at that lunch at the Lambs Club in Midtown Manhattan, I looked at him, and in the back of my head, that was it. I said, I'm writing this book. There's somebody telling me, and maybe this is just how I'm wired, because I write about, in college, people laughing at me being the president of a students' association. And so I ran for president and won. That really got my attention. No, if that's what you think, I do have a story, and it's a good one, and I'm going to write it.
Did Hillary have any memoir writing advice for you?
She didn't have advice, but she read an early version, and then she read, the final version. And she made no comments aside from, she gave me some good edits, but they were all along the lines of this in the margins. It would say, this story is very funny, or I remember this too. I mean, it was really more kind of, she was walking down memory lane as I write about losing her clothes to the East River, or waking her up at the White House and, waking up the leader of the free world simultaneously. So we kind of had that kind of an exchange during the process.
All right. One stretch of memory lane that I can't imagine was any fun for Hillary or for you was the emails. The emails, Comey, the emails. You write in the book, there's a sentence where you say, it says, Anthony, I said, wanting to shake him through the phone, if she loses this election, it will be because of you and me. Do you think that's true?
Do I think that this late breaking announcement that was unprecedented in every single way, while simultaneously there were other investigations going on that they chose to keep out of public in the interests of maintaining the integrity of the election, do I think that that was the sole cause of her loss? No. Do I think it was a factor? Absolutely. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it was.
The other thing that is making headlines in the kind of run up to the release of your book, which I guess is what happens now, the reading before people get to read it, there's a story you tell about an unnamed senator who What's the way you would describe what happened?
Well, I really want the story in the book to speak for itself. For me, I very carefully considered which stories to include and which stories to not include. And you might be surprised, especially you might be surprised to hear that this book was much longer. We had to cut a significant amount of this book. And I say that because it is a long book and you've read it. And I chose to include the story for a very specific reason. Number one, it's true, it happened. But more than that, Pamela, I had totally buried it. And to me, this notion of, back in the 2000s decade, I don't think it was just in politics. I mean, the thing that is so striking to me is as the encounter took place.
And we should say, actually, for those who are not familiar, just so that people know the basics, what happened was an unwanted advance late at night with a married senator basically going at you right on the sofa in an inappropriate way.
Yes. And in the moment, what I did is apologize. I apologized, Pamela.
Wow.
And I got up and left, which I think speaks to the culture of the way things were, certainly in politics then. And then I just buried the story, buried it. And it only surfaced when I was watching the Christine Blasey Ford takedown by, I'm not going to say who, but people saying, oh, this is very convenient that all of a sudden she's remembering these things. And as I'm literally hearing a commentator saying, oh, Christine Blasey Ford, how come she didn't remember this 10 years ago and now she remembers it? That's when I remembered it.
Well, it doesn't just happen in politics too, right?
And that's my point, is I think this is universal. And now we live in a time when I can share my story and share my truth. And that's okay, and that's accepted. And not only that, I think it's important to do. And, I did share the story in real time with one or two friends. And so I kind of approached this more as I'm being careful for a very specific reason. And that is because I know there are women and men in this country and around the world who have endured excruciating trauma, who have had either years of it or just horrible experiences that either they've taken a long time to recover from or they've never recovered from. And I don't want to equate my experience with these really important stories. And I think if I have to look at positive things that have come out of Hillary losing in 2016, one of them is this important movement, is women standing up and speaking out for themselves and owning their own truth. And this was my small participation in that space. And so I shared the story.
Another thing that strikes me about that story, in addition to the apology, which again, I will say you are not alone in that behavior. It's obviously a learned behavior. But the other thing is you describe at that moment that you go into what you called problem-solving mode. This mode of reacting where I'm going to fix this, I'm going to make it better, whether it's something to do with your job working with Hillary Clinton or something in your marriage. Is that a common theme?
I think it is a very common theme. And I think this is something inculcated in me, not consciously, but now that I've actually been through therapy, I think I can acknowledge it. I think it's something I learned from my mother. My father was terminally ill, but my mother, she made everything happen. She fixed everything. And I write, all the chapters about her from my earliest memory kind of reflect that. If I needed a new outfit, she sewed it. If I needed brownies for the bake sale, she made it. If we had to book tickets, she did it. When my dad needed his transplant, she's the one who wrote the letter to say, look, we're going to get a transplant. We're not going to, just be on dialysis, and sort of just live in this end of life care. My mom was the uber problem solver. So it probably wasn't conscious, but if you read the scene of my father's funeral, I actually write that the last thing I wanted to do was go into my room and just, as other members of my family did, they just didn't want to deal with the world. I was like, no, I got to figure out everything. We got to tell people, we got to get the funeral organized. Not that that was a problem, but it was sort of the doing, the making better, making things easier. And that has certainly carried forward in my work and in my personal life.
Well, this is a fitting place to end because we started with your father, we've ended with your mother, so we've done both and of your title, or at least one version of it.
Amazing.
Huma, thank you so much for being here.
Pamela, I'm so thrilled to be talking to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Huma Abedin's new book is called Both and. It's getting to be that time, which is time for the book review's biggest list of the year, the 10 best books of 2021. If you're a Time subscriber, you can be one of the first people to find out the list before it's published in our live event, which will be virtual, but a live edition of this podcast. We will be recording it on the morning of November 30th. My book review colleagues and I will announce and discuss this year's selections, share some of our favorites that didn't quite make the list, and we'll be joined by a special guest that I can't wait to share with you. After the announcement, our editors want to hear from you, so we'll also be holding a virtual after party where you can talk about your favorite books published this year. I hope you'll join us. You can RSVP at nytimes.com/10bestbooks, and that's 10 the word, not the number. So TEN, best books. Tina Jordan joins us now to help celebrate the 125th anniversary of the book review. Hey, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So I'm going to bring you a review from January the 8th, 1933. And the reason I'm bringing it to you is that it's funny. And I was sort of pleased to see that from the very beginning, the book review did have a tradition of hiring freelancers with a comic touch. I mean, books that needed a comic touch got it. And I think it's really hard to write funny. And this is only, I guess, mildly funny. But anyway, so the book is called Let's Go Naked by Louis Royer, translated from the French. Royer is a French journalist who inadvertently stumbled into a nudist camp in northern Germany, having gone there on the advice and introduction of a friend who had permitted him to believe that it was merely a secluded, home-like country resort. He writes divertingly of his bewilderment and embarrassment when on his arrival he found his host and all the guests in a state of nature. Conforming to the rules of the place, he soon became converted to nudism and afterwards studied the movement in various parts of Germany. His narrative consists of a great deal of apparently authentic information, much of it which will be new to American readers. The touch is light and often witty, and the humor is usually of the sardonic variety. Nevertheless, the book is, at its bottom, sincere.
Well, we always like a funny review. Tina, thank you, and bring us more.
I will. Thanks, Pamela.
Gary Shteyngart, author of many novels, joins us now. His latest one is called Our Country Friends. Gary, great to have you back on the podcast.
So great to be back.
So this book I love. I could set in with my own description, but you tell us, what in your own words is this novel about? Set the scene.
Well, it is a novel that begins in March of 2020 when things changed for the world quite a bit. And it's really about a rural pod, if you will, a group of people who find themselves in the country estate of one of their friends. There's about 8 of them. Many are immigrants from all over the world, and they find themselves sort of marooned during the beginning of the pandemic. And some of them are old friends. Many of them have secrets and betrayals. There's so many love triangles that even Tolstoy would be like, oh my God, this is too many love triangles here, But almost every permutation of love that you can imagine happens here, including the love between parents and adoptive parents and their children. So everyone's sort of in love with everyone else. They're stuck in this very idyllic rural retreat about 100 miles north of New York. And we have one person coming in who is kind of a stranger, and he is this world-famous actor.
With a capital A.
With a capital A. He's simply known as the actor. And he comes in, and as famous actors will do, he just wreaks havoc and upends everything and makes everyone sort of reconsider their relationships. I know that people are going to say, oh, it's the pandemic novel or one of the first pandemic novels, but it's really a novel about relationships and love set against the background of ye old COVID pandemic.
All right, I won't say that it's a pandemic novel, at least not here. However, I will ask if this was your pandemic project.
This was my pandemic project. I don't know how to make the yeast of the bread rise in the sourdough. I'm not even sure what it is. I'm not a baker.
This was your sourdough loaf?
This was my sourdough loaf. It did rise in the end. I got 317 pages of it to rise. So in March of 2020, I find myself upstate, where I have a little house. It's not exactly the same house that the proprietor of that estate has in the book, Sasha Senderovich, who has basically 5 cabins, beautiful cabins attached to his house, where he's able to house all of his guests. I don't have that, obviously. I'm much more simple than that. I have a tiny little guest house.
You are but a small landowner.
I am but a tiny landowner, but I did find myself there also being bored out of my mind. And I was writing this book, this dystopian novel at the time, which was supposed to be very comic. In it, NYU controlled half of New York and had their own police force, the usual stuff. And
You'll come back to that, right?
I don't know. As I was writing it, as things were getting so much worse with the pandemic, I was like, how can I write that dystopian novel when this one is so much more interesting, although a lot less funnier. And at the time, I was also rereading Chekhov, as one does when one is stuck at a country home, over and over, especially all of his stories dealing with discontented landowners 100 kilometers out of St. Petersburg, trying to sort of take baths together and stuff. And also I have, like I was saying, I had some very nice friends with whom are some of my dearest friends in the world, with whom we did form these kind of rural pods, and we would grill every weekend. I said, what am I going to do with all this time? My dystopian novel is dead. I'm reading Chekhov all the time. I'm enjoying the company of friends, and I love, and my family as well. Why don't I try to make something out of it? And this is the result. I wrote really fast because when you don't have social events to go to, and when your drinking is so much lower than it was before the pandemic, one can actually produce really quickly. So usually when I started I usually write maybe 2 pages a day in very draft form. And this was, 3 to 4 pages. It just sped along. So I was able to do it at about double the usual pace.
All right. Speaking of Chekhov, I love the way you play with these Chekhovian conventions, periodically referring to Sasha, for example, as a landowner. Like, I think I read one novel recently, I can't remember which it was, that occasionally referred to one character as an industrialist, which is such a turn of the last century word. It's such a ridiculous thing. Like, right. And I guess it's a businessman, really. So to give readers a sense of this, I would love for you to read through the very first page of your book, which is your dramatis personae.
Yes, the dramatis personae, and this is structured a little bit like a play. There's 4 acts. So the dramatis personae: Alexander Sasha Senderovsky, a writer and landowner; Masha Levin Senderovsky, his wife, a psychiatric doctor; Natasha Nat Levin Senderovsky, their child; Karen Cho, inventor of popular phone dating application and a high school friend of Senderovsky's; Vinud Mehta, a former adjunct professor and short order cook, also Senderovsky and Karen Cho's high school friend; and Kim, a gentleman; D. Cameron, a writer and former student of Senderovsky's; the actor, described by the Neue Zürcher Zeitung as the world's greatest thespian. Okay, we have to figure that one out. Neue Zürcher. How do you? Oh.
I felt you really pulled it off, but if you would like to do it again,
Zürcher
with a few more, like a little more phlegm in the throat. Go ahead.
Oh, this is killing me. Okay, the actor, described by the Neue Zürcher Zeitung as the world's greatest thespian. Various American villagers.
As Gary said, but with a gentle Swiss German
accent.
Yes,
gentle Swiss German accent. Actually, I think it's rougher than the High German.
Oh, really? So it's the Austrian that's the gentle. Austrian is gentle and sing-songy.
I have a feeling nobody's really gentle over there, but please don't quote me.
All right. All these were properly accented and articulated by the author.
Yes.
So I sense that you're getting at something, juxtaposing these older conventions with this very thoroughly modern setting and story. What's that about?
Well, I think when you're stuck in the countryside, no matter where you are, life just goes so much slower than it does in the city, and you're able to really begin to think about your place in the world. I think that's what a lot of Chekhovian characters do, whether they're in the stories or in plays like Uncle Vanya, which, without spoiling too much, has a major role to play toward the end of this book. There's definitely a feeling of time slowing down, and you're able to ascertain your true relationships. So if you love someone, you love them more in the country. If you hate them more in the country. Everything is to 11, everything is turned up to 11 over there. And you get that sense. Everyone figures out their life when they leave Petersburg or Moscow in Chekhov and begin to confront their deepest selves. And that was sort of the background for Our Country Friends, are all these people beginning to confront their deepest selves. Now, the sort of update, if you will, is that at least half of these characters, if not more, are either immigrants or children of immigrants. They're either the 1.5 generation, in other words, they came to America at an early age, the way I came when I was 7, or thereabouts.
You've obviously got this kind of Vanya on the Hudson thing going on, and it's fun if you know that area to be like, well, there's a little bit of Tivoli, and they're talking about Kingston, and there's a little Red Hook here, and
some Hudson.
Yes. So we've got the main street of Hudson, the food of Hudson.
Yes. Yeah. And I have to say, I mean, there's so much food and wine in this book, and there's so many great recipes that my friends have bequeathed to me over the course of this pandemic. The Vitella Tonato alone is worth the price of admission. I mean, there's a big wine glass on the cover, and I think that really sets the mood, because I think food and wine kept me sane during this ridiculous time. I missed people so much. I didn't know I had this kind of nostalgia or loneliness bone within me, but it was true. I just constantly kept thinking of what it would be like to populate my house with everybody I was missing, So this really became kind of my sourdough became a kind of repopulation project in my own house.
And you start actually with shopping, with food shopping and wine shopping. And I'm saying you, meaning you, the author,
yeah.
But you also, you've sort of turned yourself a little teeny bit into a kind of anti-hero, like obviously. Was that fun? Was that therapeutic?
Yeah. Was that fun? That was fun. I mean, my last project was a huge step away from autobiographical fiction because it was about this sort of hedge fund schmuck. And although my psychiatrist was like, yeah, there's still a little bit of that schmuck in you too. You're not schmuck free there. But yeah, this was fun because, well, this is a little different from some of my other more autobiographical books, because here there's just 1 out of 8 characters is more like me, right? It has some autobiographical similarities, but the other 7 are not. And the book really, it's third person, and it sort of just jumps between one character's consciousness and to another. So it's not a duet, it's whatever duet times 4 would be. An octet. I don't know. I don't speak English that well. But yeah, it's sort of hopping around their different personalities. But yes, the landowner has a lot of things in commonality with me. But, he's really sort of failed at many aspects of his life. And I don't like to write about very successful people. Like Success was the only time, well, it has success in the title, I guess, where I focused on someone, well, successful in American terms. I mean, he's very rich, right? But not successful in his personal life. So, if somebody does well in every aspect of life and has a great marriage and is just very happy and healthy, et cetera, I mean, who cares? I hate people like that, right? Who wants to read about them?
Those people. So earlier you said that the actor is kind of this driving, disruptive force, but he's aided and abetted by this speculative element that you introduce via an app. And I'm going to make you say what that app is because it's got 2 umlauts in it. And so I think it's been designed to be unpronounceable.
It's got 2 umlauts, but I have no idea how to even begin to say it. True emotions, something like that. I don't know. There's a lot of umlauts, and I'm not an umlaut person. Again, oh boy, I'm about to be canceled by Swiss Germans because I'm just keep getting all of this wrong. And I'm really sorry. Switzerland is one of my favorite 3 German-speaking countries. It's really a great place to be. Can't wait for my readings there. Please invite me. But yes, true emotions. Let's just call it true. Let's get rid of these umlauts. I mean, I had in Super Sad True Love Story, there was the apparat, right, which had all those umlauts on the device. But let's just call it true emotions. So yeah, it's a device where you take a photo with somebody. And for some people, once you take that photo and you look at the photo, you instantly fall in love with them in this very deep, disastrous way. So it's this algorithm that makes you fall in love, sort of like Midsummer Night's Dream or something like that. So Puck is now an algorithm. I should have just called it Puck. Oh, well, and put some umlauts over the U, and I don't know what that would be, but
that would confuse people.
That would really confuse people. Okay, so yeah, so true emotion. So that's one of the things that's in the book, and it makes the actor fall in love with one of the other guests. And this sort of propels all of the disasters that unfold after that. You were talking about the Chekhovian aspects, but the plot devices, well, I guess that's more Shakespearean, right? I'm not comparing myself to Chekhov or Shakespeare. I'm just saying.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I'm ripping him off, to the best of my abilities. And that's sort of what I did here.
There's love here. There's romances. There's triangles, as you said. But I don't know. To me, it seemed really also a novel about friendship.
Yes. I mean, it is. I mean, Friends is in the title. Yeah, I've written about romantic love to such an extent with my books, super sad true love story, right? Lake Success was the story of of a marriage going off the rails, right? And there's definitely romance here too, but I think the primary focus is on how friendships withstand time. And I think that's something a lot of us thought during the pandemic, because many of us were quarantined with our families if we're not single, right? We spent so much time, too much time, some would say, with our families. Not me, I loved every second of it. But it's the friendships that either were strengthened or in some ways began to fray. And I know a lot of it was carried out through social media, but I think a lot of us also found out just how useless social media is when keeping up true friendships, right? And just how much these algorithms don't do anything for our emotional and mental well-being. So for me, this was really a kind of time to reflect upon the people that I missed the most. And it was really heartbreaking in some ways to spend that much time apart from them. Something about it, I mean, I have friends who live abroad, and I even felt more distant from them in some ways, even though obviously we could communicate in the same way. There was just this feeling of just knowing that I wasn't able to hop on a plane and see them was somehow heartbreaking, just rewired ourselves as social animals. And that sort of became, and here I thought, the book really was therapeutic for me, and art should never be therapeutic. I apologize for saying that, but it became therapeutic for me because I got to fill my ears and my soul with these echoing voices. These voices. So much of this book takes place in this large covered porch. And thankfully, I have exactly that porch attached to my house upstate. And I would just sit there. And most of this book was written, a lot of this book, I would say about 2/3 of this book was written while I was sitting on that beautiful porch and just looking around and imagining what it would be like and none of these characters correspond directly to a single person, but as it is with writers, you take a bunch of people and you sort of put them through a meat grinder and out comes one character, right? And I think that's what happened here. And just populating this porch with all of these voices was therapeutic and hopefully amounted to something artistic as well.
Well, speaking of therapeutic, you satirize a lot of things, including therapeutic-infused parenting. But like most satire, obviously, there is an important core here. And one of the things that you're satirizing in some ways seems to be this particular class of people at a time when several significant crises like the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests and activism in the wake of that served to highlight the inequities between this particular class of people and everyone else, the rest of America. What is it you were trying to say? And did you find it difficult or treacherous to try to touch upon these issues?
Well, I think I was focusing on the way that I and some other people I know felt, especially those of us who were living upstate. And that was a feeling of great guilt. One of the characters is from Elmhurst, New York, from Elmhurst, Queens, I should say. And he is one of the only characters in this novel who actually is fairly impoverished. That is Vinod Mehta. And the feeling I had as somebody who grew up in Queens and watching the calamity of the pandemic unfold in Queens, and Queens is also where I grew up and where I think about half of the characters in this book grew up, right? So the feeling of being from Queens and watching that calamity unfold, and at the same time being, 100 miles north of it, in a place where those of us who adhered to the masking rules weren't getting sick, obviously, and were able to drive to the grocery stores, pick up stuff outside. There was literally almost no contact between me and other people who were also in this kind of rural pod with me. It was very sad, and it inspired quite a bit of self-loathing, I think, on our parts. And the book strives to address that because this country obviously separates everyone into these different trenches. And what the pandemic showed is that even your very survival, both the pandemic and, of course, the murder of George Floyd and many other things showed that the inequities are so large that even one's physical survival depends on which trench one belongs to. And of course, you can expand outward from that. Even the kind of health care you're entitled to, Obamacare notwithstanding, is also determines how long you're going to live, what kind of a life you're going to live. All of this came out. And I know those are weighty themes, and it may be hard to work that into a book that I hope you agree, Pamela, is funny, right, on some level.
I confirm that it's funny.
Thank you for confirming that. So these, all these themes, so the social and political themes, I think, join the theme of the pandemic, which itself is so defined by social and political themes. And I think all of that works in tandem together so that it's background, but it's important. And I think that's every book that I've written, Absurdistan was in some ways a satire of American foreign policy, right? During the oil boom era. Super Sad True Love Story is a satire of what our technology does to us. Everything I write is explores the current moment in some ways or another, whether it's dystopian satire set in the future or, Russian Debutante's Handbook, which was set during the Clinton era. I'm just trying to explore the world that I've lived through and that we're all living through. And I think this is hopefully a very contemporary book. Now, some might say, well, Gary, it's too soon. Why are you doing this so fast? Just give it a couple of years. And my reply to that is, this pandemic first isn't going anywhere.
Yeah. Also, this pandemic has lasted for like 10,000 years. I don't know what.
Yes, I have an app here and it says we're in year 11,000 of this pandemic. It's just not going anywhere. It's just going to brutalize us for a very long time because we don't have the political will to get rid of it as a population, right? But also, disasters are going to keep happening to us all the time. Right now it's a pandemic. Part of California has been burning for a while. This feeling of a life at the precipice is not going to go away. Now, is our fiction going to be only historical fiction from now on, where we, concentrate on the Monica Lewinsky years, where that was the biggest scandal we could find? Or is it
so quaint?
So quaint, and it's a lovely miniseries on FX or Hulu or something. But at the same time, I think writers, if they are writers who are writing contemporaneously, will have to focus on the world we live in now. Again, to remind you, I started out by writing a funny dystopian novel about NYU taking over part of Manhattan, but we ended with this.
Well, you brought up television. So I'm going to end with television because you've been writing for TV. You know a little bit about this Hollywood that you satirize slightly through the person of the actor. In this book, it's Succession season, right? And you've written a bit for Succession?
I worked with Succession on season 2. I haven't done anything for season 3. But season 2, yes, I joined the writer's room for a little while in London. And wow, that is just such a brain trust. I mean, those people are so smart. And I've been working in other rooms as well. It's really interesting. I mean, I love novelists. Some of my best friends are novelists. But I have to say, people in some of these rooms are truly brilliant. I mean, they just know everything about everything. And many novelists that I know and love, we concentrate on one particular aspect of the world, whether it's our own personal experience or the place we come from, et cetera. But when you hang out in a room like Succession, every single person is a walking sort of Wikipedia, and at the same time, super funny and almost to the point of being like just jaundiced about the world. And you see that in every single dialogue of Succession. Good stuff. So for me, the ability to sort of travel between the world of novels and television is perfection. I mean, this is everything I've always wanted. I am one happy fella.
I was going to say, you sound too happy, Gary. Watch for
I have problems.
Wow. Okay. Last question. I imagine that those experiences in TV informed in some way, maybe, unless you draw like a very strict line between the two, your own writing and novels. Like, did you learn anything from being in those rooms of walking encyclopedias?
Well, I mean, one thing I've always known is that I want to entertain as a writer. There's such a kind of break between so-called literary fiction and commercial fiction. I admire both if it has a voice. So when I look at some shows like Succession, what I love is that there's tension being built, there's characters interacting, there's a lot of dialogue. I teach writing at Columbia, and I tell my students that if they have dialogue, they have to read it out loud to themselves after they've written it so that they know that it's not BS, that it actually sounds the way people speak. So working in TV just reaffirms everything that I love about novels, and I love experimental novels. I love the whole, Kuskian worlds of books like that focus on interiority. But the books I write hopefully have some interiority, but are also meant to entertain from the first sentence. And I hope that that's what they do.
It is funny and full of food and wine.
Yes. Okay. That's the best blurb ever. Thank you.
All right. I blurbed your book.
Thank
Gary,
you.
I want to say before you go to our listeners, Gary Shteyngart was the first guest on the New York Times Book Review podcast way back in the day, 15 years ago, and was also our special guest at our 10th anniversary party celebration shindig for the book review. So he has a long and storied history here, and it's always a pleasure to have you.
Love the podcast. Thank you, Pamela.
Gary Shteyngart's new book is called Our Country Friends. Liz Harris joins us now with some news in the publishing world. Hey, Liz.
Hi, Pamela. So there was big news this week that surprised most people in publishing. Penguin Random House, which is the largest publisher in the United States by far, wants to buy Simon and Schuster, which is another one of the really major publishers. And because of the size of the deal and the market share that companies would have, the Department of Justice has been scrutinizing the deal really carefully. And on Tuesday, they sued to block it. And aside from the implications for publishing, that has really broad implications for how the Biden administration is going to approach antitrust concerns in general. Because for years, antitrust has sort of focused on whether or not a deal would harm consumers, which generally means whether it's going to lead to higher prices. But there's this growing movement among lawmakers and academics that approach is too narrow. And the government should also look at potential harm to people like competitors, suppliers, and workers, which in this case means authors, and specifically authors of the biggest and best-selling books. And the focus of the Department of Justice's argument is that because Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster are often the last two bidders standing for the biggest books, combining the two companies will harm authors and lower their advances. And they also say there will eventually be fewer books because of the deal. Penguin Random House is planning to fight this, and they've pushed back very hard on both of those arguments. First, they say that the rationale for the acquisition is to find savings on the back end, and that they have no plans to publish fewer books, haven't modeled it, aren't going to do it. And in September, they announced that if the two companies were combined, they would still be able to bid against each other when there are auctions for book projects, and they'd be able to bid against each other as they do now. They did say that at a certain threshold, like well above $1 million for an advance, there would be some oversight, but it's not clear exactly what that would mean. So there are a lot of people in the industry who are quietly or not quietly celebrating this move. But one group that's pretty nervous about it are many of the authors and staff at Simon & Schuster, because that company is for sale no matter what. It's owned by Viacom CBS, which put it up for sale last year. And if PRH doesn't buy it, somebody else will. So will that be another publisher less likely to make assurances not to cut editorial positions? Will it be private equity? No one knows.
All right. Can I ask a question about the elephant in the room, which is if this is a monopoly, what is Amazon?
That's an interesting question. The Authors Guild, which represents authors, they had this very measured statement in response to this. Like they didn't say it was good or bad. They just called it unexpected. And then they immediately shifted the focus to Amazon and its dominance in book selling, and then talked about looking forward to working with the Biden administration on reform that addresses the root of problems in the industry. And this merger was just a symptom. So for a lot of people, the biggest concern in the industry is Amazon. But there is an argument to be made about this very big company getting even bigger and what that would mean. But it is true that Amazon is the absolute behemoth in the room, kind of regardless.
So what are next steps? What should we be looking for with this new DOJ lawsuit?
So the DOJ sues to stop it, and PRH is going to fight it. Penguin Random House has hired a very accomplished trial lawyer, Daniel Petroselli, who successfully defended AT&T and Time Warner against the DOJ.
All right. Sounds like we'll be talking about this again in future. So thank you, Liz. More to come.
Indeed. Thank you.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Dave Kim and Sarah Lyle. Hey, guys.
Hi.
Hi, Pamela.
So, Dave, let's start with you. You haven't been here for a while. What are you reading these days?
I am reading Man in the Holocene by Max Frisch. I am finally ready for the lockdown novel after almost 2 years of resisting it. And this one is not pandemic related, as it was first published in 1979, but it's certainly going to feel familiar. The story is that an aging man is trapped at home in the Swiss Alps as this terrible storm is raging around him. And there are reports of landslides, and he's cut off from others. But at first, the stakes seem relatively low. He's just kind of hanging out at home, building houses out of crackers and reading. It's kind of a collage-like novel. It's written in this fragmentary form that has come in vogue in recent years, but at the time, I think was quite unusual. We get inventories, snippets from the encyclopedia about weather and dinosaurs and geology. And at one point, he sets off from his house to try to make it through a mountain pass, but he turns around and then heads back to the house. And we start to learn, we learn a few things, that his mind is starting to go and he seems to be prone to blackouts. and that the landslides are a lot closer and a much bigger threat than he thinks. And so we slowly start to realize that his situation is far worse than he seems to understand. And so the suspense slowly starts to build. But this isn't really a suspense novel. It's much more a book about the banal creep of mortality and about life being reduced to facts and gestures and just pure concrete details once our memories start to slip from us. As he's starting to read, he's reading about ground erosion and mass extinction and glacial melt. And we get the sense of the inevitable, the era of humankind. The Holocene is, going to go of the way of the dinosaurs. This book maybe fits all too well the cliche of the late career novel. It's short, it's formally strange, obsessed with mortality, but I'm finding it no less profound. And it's quite short, so you can be released from lockdown fairly quickly.
Well, I love a good book about the banal creep of mortality.
That's right. Me too.
What are your other top topics in that subgenre?
Can I ask a question about that? I'm so interested in this notion of during a very anxious time, the number of people who seem to be taking some kind of pleasure, refuge, solace, or whatever in books that to me would increase my anxiety. And I'm really interested in why this appeals to you right now.
I felt the same way for 2 years as I was previewing books that were starting to come out about the pandemic, about lockdown books. And I just had this sort of visceral repulsion. I just didn't want to read it because I was experiencing it. And I just, it was the last thing I wanted. I wanted escapism. I wanted stuff that reminded me of a different time. Even if it was bleak, I didn't want this particular kind of bleak. And I think at this point, I'm much more open to it and I'm curious about it because I guess I'm in a more reflective mode as I sort of start to see the light at the end of the tunnel of this pandemic, as I'm starting to go out more and, as life slowly starts to come back to normal in New York City. And I think at this point, I want the analysis and I want to look back and think about what I went through. And this book is it's not like a suspense novel. As I said, it's not a, what's going to happen next kind of novel. It's philosophical. It's a much quieter book about the fleetingness of life. And that's kind of what I want. I want to understand these past 2 years in some way. What are you reading, Sarah?
Well, I'm still sort of digesting what you've just said. It's so impressive. I've been writing a thrillers column for the Times Book Review, and as a result, I read a ton of thrillers all the time of very different degrees of quality. And so for my spare time reading, I'm trying to read things that I know I'm going to like, by authors that I know already or that I, are very
book reviewers lament. It's like, because I must read all of this crap in my fun time, I will read good things.
You said it, Pamela. And I also find, I go back and reread things that I love because they bring me this sort of comfort that you don't seem to need anymore. And I still need. And, like a lot of people, I've been listening to audiobooks when I take walks, and I choose them carefully because I think it really matters who the reader is. So I recently, I just finished actually yesterday listening to the audiobook of A Wrinkle in Time, one of my all-time favorite books. I know that Pamela's read it because we've talked about it before, and I'm sure a lot of listeners have read it as well. I hadn't read it for a very long time, but I read it so many times as a girl that I remembered a lot of it verbatim. So some of the speeches that came, I could hear them in my head as they were unfolding. It was pretty exciting. But the thing about children's books is what you're trying to find in rereading them is not just the story, but also how you felt as a kid when you read it. That sense of wonder, that sense almost ecstatic pleasure that you found in reading back then that's very hard to replicate as an adult. And for those listeners who don't know what it's about, it's fantasy science fiction, but also very personal and emotional book about a young woman who's a misfit at home, who's a bookworm, but also a math geek. And her father and mother are both scientists, and her father has been missing for the last couple of years. And it seems he went on a secret mission for NASA. and hasn't come home, and she's been teased at school, and her mother's very sad, and a whole series of adventures ensue, culminating in getting to go to other planets and new types of physics. And it's really an extraordinary book. I read it the year after my father died, so I was 9 years old, and I read it, as I say, many, many times. And in hearing it as an adult, I thought back to myself then. And one of the things that it's really about is a girl missing her father and finding a way to be reunited with him, which of course was wishful thinking for me at the time. But it's also, an amazing book for a girl, because it was the first time I'd ever read a book where there was a heroine who was very flawed, wasn't popular, wasn't pretty, wasn't easy to get along with, and she was able to use her faults to prevail and to essentially save the universe. And it's full of whimsy and full of wonderful details. The one thing that I hadn't noticed as a kid is that it feels very much like some of the things that she's writing about are a stand-in for Stalinist Russia. So I felt an overlay of politics rereading it that I hadn't thought of at the time. I'm not sure if that's the right interpretation, but that's how it felt to me.
It's funny. I don't know if you know this, but I wrote an essay for the Times about 10 years ago called I Was a Sci-Fi Heroine about this book. So,
Amazing, amazing.
yeah. But who's doing the reading? Who's the narrator in the audiobook you're listening to?
It's the actress Hope Davis. And, and I think she really gets the book. She loves it. She does all the voices. She does most of them incredibly well. I don't like her voices of the young men in the book. Charles Wallace and Calvin don't quite work for me, but everyone else is great. I've listened to quite a few audiobooks during this period as well. And I listened to one thriller on an audiobook, and it was pretty clear to me that the narrator thought the book was really stupid, the way he almost made fun of it as he was narrating it. So I'm quite attuned to that. Like there's one, so this, never reviewed this. I just sort of listened to it for fun. And these people were trying to like discover some secret thing that in the computer somewhere, and they get to someone's house and they're like, oh my God, he has an advanced computer. And the way the narrator said advanced computer was so funny. But my point about that is that Hope Davis loves this and has a sort of awe of it and a reverence for it that I think is exactly appropriate to the language of Madeleine L'Engle.
And she's on Succession right now.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's a whole other thing, isn't it?
Yes. That's for the Sidebar Succession podcast.
Right.
I want to hear about the Stalinist commentary. I don't remember. I mean, I read it when I was a kid and I haven't read it since, so I don't really recall that.
Oh, remember like the balls bouncing all at the same time? There's a lot.
Well, so they go to this planet called Camazotz. And one of the great things about the book is this notion of a dark shadow. The universe is under a dark shadow. Some planets are totally covered by darkness. And Earth is a young planet, and it's shadowed by darkness, but it has all these people fighting. So they mention who would it be? It would be Copernicus and Shakespeare and Madame Curie. And it's kind of thrilling, especially now when sometimes things seem really tough. But we're like everybody, there are people who are fighting really hard not to succumb to the toughness. And so they get to this planet, and the whole point of the planet is everybody is subsumed to this collective society under the control of this entity called it. And you're supposed to do everything at exactly the same time. You go to bed at the same time. The kids bounce the ball, as Pamela said, at the same time. You're not allowed to think for yourself. And the notion of it is we will, in this sort of communist way, I think, we will take care of you. It's much easier not to think for yourself. It's a little bit also like it reminded me of the Grand Inquisitor, that part in the middle of Dostoevsky, the Brothers Karamazov, where the Spanish Inquisitor argues with Jesus about free will, essentially, and what's better for people to be under the thrall of a totalitarian socialist regime or to be able to think for themselves. And that's the big tension on Camazotz is how do you break free from this entity that controls everything?
That's fascinating. I guess I just haven't thought about the book in a really long time.
But Dave, it's like rereading the Narnia Chronicles as an adult. And I was sort of miffed when I realized what a Christian parable they were meant to be. Like, I would like to think of these as fantastic stories that don't have this other stuff. The coda to what I'm saying, though, is that Madeleine L'Engle's granddaughter has a fascinating afterword to this audiobook that I listened to. And she says that she doesn't believe her grandmother intended it to be specific to Stalinist Russia. I'm not sure if that's, what the truth is to that, but at least that's her reading of it.
Hmm.
So, Pamela, are you reading some kids' books? Like, what's going on with you? What are you reading for fun these days?
No, I'm actually, the book I'm reading right now, I'm not done with. I've just started it. So I'm not going to talk about it on this podcast, but I'll return to it, is Frank Rich's memoir, Ghostlight, which is just like spellbinding. But knowing you were going to be on the podcast, I decided, and that you are, as you mentioned earlier, our thrillers columnist, I decided to talk about two thrillers that I read recently. And the tie into children is that I read these because I got them for my teenage daughter, who is in a thriller phase. And I grabbed a bunch of thrillers from the office and brought them home for her. And now I'm reading her cast-offs. So she's already read these. And it's funny because when I ask her what they're about, she's like, "Oh, I don't know. I don't remember." So she inherited that from me. I can barely remember what either of these books are about, and I read them within the last month. But they are The Flight Attendant by Chris Bojalian and Perfect Little Children by Sophie Hannah. They're very different, although there's some commonalities. And I remember actually asking you, probably around 4 or 5 years ago, you'd reviewed a book by Sophie Hannah in the Times, and I was like, "Oh, I've never read Sophie Hannah," and I think I asked you for some advice. And it wasn't this book, because I think this may be her most recent one. And it has like a very creepy little thing on the cover that says, "12 years have passed, so why don't Thomas and Emily look a day older?" And that's the kind of central mystery. It's about a woman who goes back to see her ex-best friend's house and sees her ex-best friend there. They haven't talked in a number of years, 12 years, and she is sitting in her car outside the house. The ex-best friend and two little children pop out looking exactly like Thomas and Emily, but at the same age they were when the friendship fell apart. And so you are wondering what has happened. Is this some kind of cloning thing? Is it some crazy secret plot? Is the narrator crazy? Which I feel like there's where you have something in common with the other book, The Flight Attendant, and with almost every other kind of domestic or psychological thriller, right? You're intended to ask, like, is the person telling us this story crazy, or am I? It's like someone must be somehow not getting it. The Flight Attendant, really different book, is about this woman, Cassandra Bowden, who is a flight attendant and an alcoholic. And it sort of is kicked off when she wakes up in a hotel room in Dubai next to someone she's been out with, flirting and having fun with. And the guy is in her bed dead.
I hate it when that happens. I just like to interject.
To you, or just generally in a book?
Well, when you have a one night stand and they're dead in the morning.
It's insulting is what it is. It's like, really, was it that? No. Yeah, but I actually love that, that sort of premise, which of course is the premise for many a thriller. And I had never read a book by Chris Bojalian. He's a really good writer. It's commercial, but it's smart commercial, smart thriller stuff, and funny. Speaking of Dostoevsky, I can't remember if Dostoevsky is in here, but there's a lot of Russian literature. I think there's definitely Tolstoy. There's a kind of intelligence assumed on the part of the reader that I found gratifying. It's definitely not lowest common denominator reading. The Sophie Hannah she's a British writer. It's a little bit less literary in quality, but it definitely had me turning the pages, because what she does at the very beginning, which I think is effective, is she throws around all the ridiculous theories that you might be thinking of why these kids don't look older and knocks them down. So you're like, okay, well then, so what is it? And it keeps you going until you finally figure out the answer. Have you read either of these authors before, Sarah?
I reviewed a different book by Bojalian, and I thought it was fantastic. I think he's really good. I actually saw that one on the HBO series that aired at some point during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah. How was it?
Actually, it was great. And maybe knowing the answer, knowing the solution, you might not want to see it, because part of what was fun was just the mystery unfolding. But it was very well acted. It was really good. And Sophie Hannah, I've been fascinated by for years. I have to say, I think her earlier books are a little better. I feel she specializes in setting up a totally preposterous scenario as the one you've described, where, like somebody will see someone being murdered, let's say, and they get there the next day and no one there, house isn't there, the room isn't there, the person isn't there,
Right.
no one's heard of them. And then she's sort of back, and there's always like a woman who starts, making a fuss because she's like, I saw these things happen, I saw blah blah blah, and no one believes her except for the police often seem to believe her and spend a lot of time trying to help her. And it's weird. But I think she's interesting. I think she's a very smart writer. But I would start with her with some of her earlier stuff, which is super creepy and good. The other thing about Sophie Hannah that's really interesting is she's written some Agatha Christie novels, I guess. I don't know if the estate has hired her or what, but she's done some really good classic closed door mysteries that are very playful and actually, I think, a lot smarter than the real Agatha Christie ever was, like just more sophisticated.
Wow. Yeah, she does like Hercule Poirot mysteries.
Yes, and a couple they're not Hercule Poirot, I think. I think she's done 4 of them. I think they're great. There's one called The Monogram Murders, there's The Killings at Kingfisher Hill, and I would say The Little Face is one of my favorite. It's, I think, her first one from 2006. Kind of Cruel was really good, Lasting Damage. So she's definitely somebody who you wanna watch what she's doing.
And what about the Chris Bojalian, which was the one that you really loved?
So the one I reviewed, God, not that long ago, it seems like forever, was called The Red Lotus. It was a little bit about, my memory is it's about rats and using rats to weaponize some kind of plague, and really creepy. Anything about rats biting you, anything about rats carrying something worse than the bubonic plague because it was manufactured in a laboratory is pretty creepy. I think his pacing is really good. I think his plots are great. And, they hang together. They make sense even when they're preposterous.
I like that. Rats. I'm trying to think about like what's creepier carrying the plague, rats or monkeys?
I think rats are the creepiest.
Flight attendants.
Also, Michael, in the TV show, in the HBO series, I remember her like knocking back the miniature vodkas in the hold as she was working as a flight attendant. I thought, like, how do you pull that off? Like drinking on the job and, being like a full-blown alcoholic the whole time you're working.
I wonder how common that is. I've always thought flight attendants would make great subjects for novels. I mean, it's the idea of people who like spend most of their lives flying across the world, but like spend most of it actually in a steel tube and bad hotels.
It's funny you should say that because after reading this book, and he does give a lot of good flight attendant detail. I think he definitely did his research. I had this feeling of, I need to read at least 6 other books about flight attendants. There's just a lot to explore there.
There were a couple of thrillers set on planes that came out this fall where flight attendants were figured in them. One of them, I think the pilot got some kind of note saying, either you crash the plane or your whole family will die. And then there was some other one. And of course, we think about flight attendants, having to deal with things on 9/11 to bring this to a depressing moment.
I'm going to bring it back up, which is a line from a David Sedaris essay that ends with the flight attendant going around the cabin saying, "You're trash, you're trash, you're trash." And the nice little double meaning there.
Yes. Yes.
All right, let's run down the titles that we read this week. Dave, starting with you.
Mine is Man in the Holocene by Max Frisch.
Mine is A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline L'Engle, read by Hope Davis.
And I read Perfect Little Children by Sophie Hannah and The Flight Attendant by Chris Bojalian. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosato from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.